Today's guest is Vauhini Vara, who is a journalist and prize-winning author. And today we're discussing her new book, Searches, Selfhood in the Digital Age. Thank you so much, Vauhini, for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's actually interesting, Vauhini, you and I are about 30 days apart in terms of our birth. I won't give the year, but you're August 1st. I'm July 2nd. Both in kind of in the early 1980s.
Yeah.
And we kind of graduated high school around the exact same time. And basically you were growing up in Canada. Once you hit kind of middle school, you moved to the Seattle, Washington area. And this of course is in the 90s when, Amazon was coming up. Microsoft, of course, would have been fairly established at this time. And then you went to university at Stanford, which for people that aren't familiar with the West Coast is kind of in the heart of Silicon Valley. It's 20 minutes away from like the Googleplex, things like that. And so you would have started university in 2000. So you basically kind of grew up like during like the .com kind of start, you would have also experienced the .com collapse or the bubble, whatever we want to call it. So it's pretty interesting. So what was it kind of like growing up in Seattle, Washington, in the 90s, and then going to Stanford at kind of like the heart of the social media with Facebook and all the other tech companies growing up. And then, of course, you became a tech journalist and things like that. So this is like your life for like years. So can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I didn't identify growing up and in some ways still don't identify as somebody who's deeply immersed in the world of tech, which is funny because I've written, 2 of my 3 books are on that subject. But I think what happened is, as you know, because you grew up around the same time, is that as we were coming of age, it kind of became impossible to be a person in the world and not have tech be a part of our media landscape. So when we moved to Seattle, I would go and like sit on the floor of the Barnes and Noble in Bellevue, Washington, and read books and magazines. That was the same Barnes and Noble where Jeff Bezos and his wife at the time, Mackenzie, and their colleagues were building Amazon right around the same time. And then I get to college in 2000, just after the founders of Google had founded Google essentially out of a Stanford research project. Then in my senior year at Stanford, I was working at the school paper, and Stanford became one of the first universities where Facebook launched. And I edited some of the Stanford Daily's first articles about this new, website called Facebook that had come to campus and was taking campus by storm. And so, technology has just always been a part of my like social, public, and private life by virtue of when and where I grew up.
In the book, I found it interesting. In 2017, you're saying that you had an interview with Sam Altman, and he also happened to have like a rubber ducky collection. I kind of remember that from the book, which I thought was interesting. That I guess his grandma gave him. But like, what was it like meeting Sam Altman in 2017 and seeing that rubber ducky collection?
Yeah, I mean, he was well known within Silicon Valley at the time. I think the New Yorker had previously profiled him, but he was not a household name the way he is now. And so when I profiled him in 2017, he invited me over to his house, and, I rang the doorbell and he came out to open the gate for me and walked me into his house. It was a very sparely decorated house in general, I would say, but he had this rubber ducky collection from his beloved grandmother. And, he came across like a lot of these individuals who run tech companies come across as somebody who was really ambitious, really intelligent, really felt that he was changing the world in positive ways and felt really committed to figuring out how to do that. That's what I find so interesting about these people. I mean, I wrote about Mark Zuckerberg in the early days of Facebook as well, and sort of got the same impression of him. I don't think any of these people, Mark Zuckerberg or Sam Altman or any of them, are sort of, like running around like super villains trying to make the world a worse place, right? I think these people really feel strongly that they're doing something beneficial to society. And yet their products are built in such a way and funded in such a way that um, their primary goal is not to do something great for society, but rather to make money for investors.
Right now, you live in Fort Collins, Colorado. When did you make the move from, you went to Stanford and then you kind of worked at some other publications, but how long did you live in San Francisco for? And then when did you move to Fort Collins?
I lived in the Bay Area. I mean, starting when I arrived there for college in 2000, I lived in the Bay Area up until 2015, off and on. So really through the rise of big tech, I would say. And then we had a baby in 2015, and we're living in a rent controlled 1 bedroom apartment and would not have been able to afford to stay in the Bay Area and be relatively comfortable in terms of our living space. And so that year, my husband, who's also a writer and a creative writing professor, got a job at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. And so we moved here then about 10 years ago.
Right. So you were basically in Silicon Valley for 15 years. How much did Silicon Valley change in the 15 years? I mean, it's like if you read a book from like the 1960s where it's like a lot of the people back that were living in the Bay Area kind of thought if you like computers, you were part of the establishment because of course like DARPA, the US government funded the start of the internet. I mean, a lot of the I guess people thought like it was just a centralized control. But then all of a sudden in the 90s, then you were like a rebellious person. You were a hacker. It was like anti-establishment. And then all of a sudden now it's back to being centralized control. So we've had these kind of cycles of like, if you think it's good or bad or who controls it. So 15 years in Silicon Valley, you had a pretty good, long window of seeing the ebbs and flows of it.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that rather than it being this sort of like seesaw swinging from one side to the other in terms of like whether people think the internet is a force for good or evil, I think that those two strains have always sort of been running in parallel, since like the mid 70s when personal computers, mid to late 70s, early 80s when personal computers, right, started evolving. And there were people developing software who thought that software should be free, and had a kind of like anarchic approach to thinking about what software was and what the goals should be of people developing software. And then Bill Gates comes along, right, and is like, well, I'm developing software with my friends and we put a lot of time and resources into it and we think we should get paid, right? And then that became the dominant mode. So I think there have always been those two strains, I think. And I think that was the case throughout my time in Silicon Valley, like at the same time that the Googles and Metas and Apples of the world were growing and compounding their dominance, their power, their wealth, websites like Wikipedia were growing. Browsers like Mozilla's Firefox were being used, right? And so there have always been these alternate models to the sort of model of corporate dominance. I think it's just that because the model of corporate dominance tends to come along with the capitalism, tends to come with a lot of resources, oftentimes the products built under those models end up being particularly dominant products.
And so, since we're talking about your book today, Searches Selfhood in the Digital Age, for people that say haven't read this book, what's kind of like a short summary of it?
I think of the book as being about the way in which big technology companies' products offer us a space for self-expression, for communion with others, for empowerment, while also benefiting the companies, that is, benefiting every time we use those products in that way. So every time I use a Google search to express something about some deeply held desire or need for knowledge that maybe I can't even express to another human being, Google gives me some amount of information in response to that search. Google also benefits from knowing that I desire or need that information, right? I mean, the same is true of all of these products. Every time I post something on social media, it might be, a really beautiful expression of my selfhood. At the same time, the social media company is using that expression of my selfhood to determine how to sell things to me. And again, these companies amass information not just about me, but about all of us, such that they end up with that information widening the gap between the gap in knowledges and resources on our part and on their part, which is where I see like the interesting what seems like a dichotomy, but I think is really sort of like a symbiotic relationship of codependence. So that's what the book is about. But I'm telling that story narratively, but I'm also using the company's products to sort of enact what that looks like on the page.
You talk a lot about your older sister, of course, who unfortunately passed away where you were in university at Stanford from cancer, and then you kind of used Chat GPT later on to kind of write a narrative about her. So, like, do you want to talk about like how like you were actually using Chat GPT to, it seemed kind of like deal with some kind of long lost um, grief, so to speak?
Yeah, well, let me back up and say so it wasn't ChatGPT actually. ChatGPT had not launched yet. This was an early language model from OpenAI, the company that would later go on to build ChatGPT. But ChatGPT ended up being very different from the technology that I used, which was this large language model called GPT-3 that wasn't available to the public yet. And what it did was you would type some text and it would complete that text for you. I was really interested with this technology in thinking about the way I think about Google or Amazon or any other company, thinking about like what the organization behind this technology was claiming to offer to us, right? So if this technology existed that could complete a text, that could essentially generate language for us, what is it? Like, what is the personal need, the personal desire that would be responding to? And it got me thinking about the thing in my life for which I always struggled to find words, which was the death of my sister and my grief over it. It was something that I'd written about fictionally, but had not really written about non-fictionally ever, and was even something I had a hard time talking about. Right. And so I went into this. I got access to this tool through my connection to Sam Altman that I had from having interviewed him several years earlier. And I typed this sentence that was when I was in my freshman year of high school and my sister was in her junior year. She was diagnosed with Ewing sarcoma. Ewing sarcoma is the name of the cancer she had. I hit the button and it generated this text, sort of purportedly about the death of my sister, but it wasn't actually it. I hadn't told it my sister had died. It didn't actually know anything about me or my sister. It generated this text about from the perspective of somebody whose sister gets diagnosed with Ewing sarcoma. And at the end of that text, it writes, she's doing great now. So in essence, it's sort of writing the opposite of what my experience and my sister's experience was. And so I thought, well, maybe what I need to do is write more of my own text to give this AI model more to work with, right? Because the way that model works, which is very different from how ChatGPT works, is that it would use the actual subject and syntax of the language it was given as a kind of predictor of what the likeliest, what the next words should be, right? And so what it was doing is that as I wrote more, it had more material to work with in trying to kind of match the subject and syntax of what I had written. And what happened was that over time, I kind of did this over and over as I added more language of its own. It got closer to using language that described grief in ways that felt somewhat familiar, that described grief that felt somewhat like my experience of grief, but it never actually could, describe my grief as I write in the book, right? So in some ways, the whole exercise ends up being a demonstration of the promise that these companies' products have, the promise that this organization, OpenAI, is making when it says we can give you a product that's going to tell your story for you. The gap between that and the reality, which is that only we can tell our own stories because only we have the experiences that we have, the position in the world that we have.
What year did you start working on this book, Searches?
The first chapter that I wrote was a chapter made up of my own Google searches. I wrote that in 2019. So that started in 2019. That was the first thing I wrote that ended up in the book. There's some bits that I include in the book from previous reporting, actually, as early as 2006. But I think 2019 is when I started sort of conceiving of the material that would make this a book in the form that it now has.
When I started this interview mentioning about how you had this interview with Sam Altman in 2017, and then of course you had this relationship with Altman, so you kind of had like this precursor to ChatGPT. ChatGPT, was it 3 was released in was it 2021, I believe, or is it?
ChatGPT was released in 2022.
It was 2020, November 2022. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. So there was no ChatGPT before that, but there were these models called GPT and then GPT-2 and then GPT-3. So the one I was using was GPT-3.
So you're right. So you're using this model that wasn't even released to the public.
Yeah.
Basically, right. But I guess, kind of my question is like, what did people think when you were writing this at first? Because of course no one even had access to this, and all of a sudden, in 2022, at the end 2023, people were like blown away. And then all of a sudden, recently we had DeepSeek come out where it's like, we don't have to use all this electricity, we don't need all this computing power, and it kind of like the AI bubble is starting to burst. So it seems like you were kind of writing this book ahead of the curve, and then now you've kind of seen like this whole arc within a few years. But did people think this was like insane when you were writing this book in 2019? You had to be talking to your friends about this, and I'm sure on the phone with friends back in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, I mean, do you mean the part having to do with AI specifically?
Yeah, the AI. Yeah, okay. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think of AI as being a relatively small aspect of the book. I was really interested in big technology companies' power. That was what the book was, and the relationship between that and our language, our textual language, our visual language. When I wrote that chapter, which started out as an essay called Ghosts in 2021, I don't know. I wasn't really talking to people about it because I didn't know that I was writing an essay. I was just playing around with this tool. But my husband, as I mentioned, is also a writer. And so he was aware that I was working on this. And he is somebody who has always been very aware, I think, of the relationship between technology and power, right? The relationship between the products we use and the entities, usually corporations, behind those products. And so he immediately said, wait a minute, like, is this a good idea? Is it a good idea to use this product that could put us out of business as writers, right? That is claiming that it is able to do a thing that's going to put us out of business as writers, which I think was a reasonable question. And in some ways is the question of my whole book, right? Is it viable to use the products of these big technologies as a form of critique of the companies, or am I just playing into their hands in doing so?
Since we're talking about this, but you basically say, like, I believe it was, I can't remember exactly. I've read this piece from Sam Altman, but you also mentioned it where he says something like in the next, I don't know, 10 or 15 years, like 90% of jobs are basically going to be non-existent because AI is going to replace them. And then every person is going to get like $13,500. I believe it's like per year. Essentially, it's like a UBI. What she's like, well, it doesn't sound like that much money, but you have to realize that the price of a lot of these goods are going, close to zero because they're being replaced by AI. So it's actually a lot of money. One, I guess, do you think that's true? And then, what's kind of like your thought process on that?
I mean, I think he and all of these tech CEOs have he has this tendency, so do the others, of describing like one potential future as if that is the inevitable future that we are moving toward, right? I mean, I wouldn't claim to know for a fact that the world he describes is not the world we will end up in. I can't claim to know for a fact that if we end up in that world, it will be negative for us rather than positive for us, right? And I think that's what's especially interesting here. I think these companies and their leaders have an incentive to describe one possible future, and that's the future that benefits them and their companies, by the way, not incidentally, right? To describe that future as if that is the future that will come to pass. And I was really committed in this book to not make prognostications about the future as if I have any idea what the future will be like. What I was really committed to doing in this book was to make the case that there are all kinds of possible futures, including futures not dominated by big technology companies, including futures in which AI maybe isn't a significant feature of our daily lives, right? Because acknowledging that then opens us up to be able to imagine what all of those possible futures might be and which ones we actually want.
Since you live in Fort Collins, which is, of course, a college town, I also live in a college town. And so when I'm out and about, I'll talk to university students. And it seems I'm actually shocked that like they're not really too like big onto the various AI tools and things like that. I guess the question is, I guess I have more hope that we're not just going to be sucked into like outsourcing our thought processes to these various AI tools, which is what I think a lot of maybe older people fear. And I always find it interesting where older people are talking about how these young people are always on like Instagram or TikTok, yet they spend most of their life on like Facebook or something. So it's like, well, you're like criticizing someone for doing the same thing you're doing. I've talked to friends that spend a lot of time on Twitter, and they're like, I never spend time on social media. And I'm like, you tweet like 800 times a day. And they're like, tweeting is the news. That's not social media. I'm like, okay, potato, potato. Okay. Like you're on social media. Admit it, like.
Yeah. I mean, I think I find it useful to both to acknowledge the fact that like these products are entrenched in our daily lives, and sort of like to acknowledge that and to acknowledge that we do have agency in the matter, because again that opens us up to the possibility that we could make different choices.
One of the things, Wahini, in your book, you talk a lot about is surveillance capitalism, which is a book. It's one of my favorite books. I've read that book a couple times, and and I guess one of the bigger issues I have, I guess I'm not so much, you talk a lot about like the power and the control, which that doesn't concern me as much as just like the privacy issues. But it seems like the privacy issue with a lot of these things and just the way they're able to manipulate you because they know more about you than probably your spouse knows about you. Or your family, based on like you mentioned, you showed all like your Amazon purchases, all your Google searches. You can tell. I mean, hell, they know if you're pregnant before you know you're pregnant or whatnot. Especially now where we have like you hook up the Fitbit and you hook up all these. I'm gonna like take a blood prick and hook that up to my app, whatever. So they know all this data about you, and it would be really easy to kind of I guess you could say manipulate you to be able to, whether it's for political gain, whether it's for financial gain, and that goes all into the surveillance capitalism type of avenue that you discussed in the book.
Yeah, I mean, Shoshana, the Shoshana Zuboff book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, which I mention often in the book because I think it's the way that I appreciate the way in which she describes why it matters, like what the broader relevance is of the fact that these companies know so much about us. It seems abstract, right? Like, all right, these companies know so much about us, but who cares? Like, it's, how does that affect my daily life? She makes the case that what's happening is that these companies are engineering what she calls an epistemic coup, as in a coup in which the substance of the coup isn't land gained in a war or bodies in the seat of power, but rather knowledge, right? A coup where the currency is knowledge. And what she argues compellingly, I think, is that what these companies are doing is that they are amassing so much knowledge about us that they will ultimately have this body of knowledge that they are growing. They're creating this body of knowledge that far exceeds anything that we as individuals, as communities, as institutions that we build ourselves can possibly know. And that knowledge can be converted into financial gain, and importantly, into political gain, right? So the fact that Google knows all my searches, Amazon knows all my purchases, OpenAI, if I use ChatGPT frequently, can know a lot about my personal daily emotional life. All of those things together um, seem like abstract bits of knowledge that don't really matter. But knowing all that about me and you and all of us actually can lead to the ability to create social systems of power that increase their dominance over the rest of us.
How do you think like these AI tools like ChatGPT will kind of evolve over the next, like, I don't know, say 5 years? Actually, I lived in Costa Rica for a while, and one of my good friends, I was having a conversation with her recently, and she's getting a master's degree, and she was telling me that all of her classes right now are there's no actual, like, you sit down, you take a test, you have to do a presentation, and you have to get in front of the class, you have to put on a presentation. People kind of give you a Q&A, the students, the teacher, because they're so afraid of the students just using Chat GPT. And that's kind of like how school was, or university was, in like the 1960s. You had smaller classes, you had oral presentations. It almost seems like this might be a benefit if they're so afraid. And because, like, if you're using like a Chat GPT, it's just kind of like scraping all the data of the internet, so you kind of have more of a uniform response. You like kind of like that creative thinking or outside the box thinking is kind of restrained by those tools. So what, are we going to do like say like my friend in Costa Rica, where we're going to actually just go back to different techniques, or are we going to be kind of restrained by the thinking in a box? Like, what do you think?
I mean, I think the question to start with is it inevitable that AI will be an increasing part of our lives, including on college campuses, right? I mean, I think about a technology like those glasses with, Google Glass with the internet in them, where we kind of just decided together that that was not something we were interested in, and that it went away, right? I mean, we can still make those kinds of decisions about AI, about these specific products like chatbots. I think there are a lot of resources going into telling university professors and administrators that AI is the future and that students will be left behind if they don't learn to use these tools and if they don't use them as aids. There is research that suggests that that is not cognitively beneficial to students, right? Microsoft and Carnegie Mellon did this study where they found they had, talked to knowledge workers, like white collar workers, about their use of these things, and found a decline in cognitive development for the knowledge workers using these tools. And so there's a really real risk, especially when you're talking about students who are still figuring out how the world works, still trying to understand what they think about the world. It's also that I could go on and on about this, but it's also the case that these tools, the text they produce, the images they produce, are not neutral. They represent, as you're saying, a very particular kind of rhetoric about the world. And so one can imagine a future in which, if students are depending more and more on these, especially in things like writing assignments, we end up these products end up influencing the opinions, the worldviews, the perspectives of these students in ways that are potentially really toxic.
In 1964, Marshall McLuhan, he had the famous quote of like the medium is the message. Yeah. And I was 1964, over 60 years ago, and I'm thinking, like, what is, if the medium is the message, back kind of like the early days of the TV and whatnot, like what does that mean in 2025?
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes think that not only is the medium the message, but the ownership is the message, right? So yes, the medium itself influences the way in which a message it influences the way in which a message is conveyed, and it can even be said that the medium and the message are indistinguishable, right? It's also the case that, to the extent that AI text or images are generated based on decisions that a parent company is making about the kinds of text and images that should be generated, it is absolutely the case that any text generated, any image generated by a product owned by these companies is going to represent that company's worldview, right? Which is, and desires and financial motivations, which is very different from the way in which humans use language and use images.
You said your husband's a professor in Fort Collins at the university there. I mean, you must have conversations with your husband. Like if you're like, say, like a university student, should you focus on certain majors because AI will potentially replace you like in 5 years? I mean, if you're a freshman and what is it, it takes 5.5 years for the average college student to graduate in the United States of America. So like if you're a freshman, I mean, you're projecting well over 4 years out. Do you have any conversations with your husband? And I saw that you also give some talks at university. So you're engaging with these university students. You're kind of immersed in this. What advice do you have on that front?
I mean, I hesitate to give advice. I don't know that I'm enough of an expert to be able to say to a student, here's what you should or shouldn't do. I think people are endlessly capable of making decisions of their own. I'm interested in having people be well informed about how these technologies work. But because I think often these technologies, AI products specifically, are positioned neutrally. They're positioned as sort of helpful aids for anybody. When in reality, anytime we use these products, the goals of the company behind the product are being implemented, right? Both in by virtue of their being able to absorb information about us through our use of the products, and through being able to influence us through the text they give us, right? As which I enact obviously in my book. I pretend to ask ChatGPT for advice about the book I'm writing, and it proceeds to suggest to me that I write a book that is more positive about big technology companies and about Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI in particular, right?
So what are your biggest fears about big technology right now?
Uh eh, my biggest fears. I mean, I don't know that I would frame it that way. I think what I'm interested in doing is like describing the world that we're in. I mean, I guess one way to conceive of a fear is to say, my fear is that we end up in a world like the ones that these big technology CEOs are describing, in which they and their products become increasingly powerful, and the rest of us therefore are more and more dependent on them, and therefore vulnerable to exploitation by them.
We started this off you talking about your meeting with Sam Altman, but you also, I mean, you worked at the Wall Street Journal as a tech reporter, and you covered Apple and Facebook. I guess now Facebook's now Meta, but like, have you ever met and interviewed Mark Zuckerberg in person, or Tim Cook, or Steve Jobs before he passed away?
Yeah, so I never covered Apple. I think you're referring to the moment in my book where I talk about being offered the Apple beat, but that was when
Oh, right. That's
I
you turned it
left.
down. Right. You're right.
I turned it
Right.
down.
You turned it
I
down.
did. I
That's
was
right.
I was the Wall Street Journal's first Facebook reporter, and so yeah, I did meet Mark Zuckerberg on a bunch of occasions. I didn't know him particularly well, but yeah, I did meet him, and he struck me as really intelligent, really intellectually curious, very ambitious, very concerned with building a company that he thought would make the world a better place. I think he believed all those things. It has been many, many years since I've interacted with him, but I imagine that when he's asked questions about, the effect his products have had on the world, and he answers that he thinks it's positive, I do imagine that he is answering in good faith, right? I don't know that I would argue that he's lying when he answers in that way. And I think that's what makes the situation complex. It's more interesting than to say there are these evil villains out there trying to make the world a worse place. I think that the issues are systemic issues.
Who were you more impressed by, Zuckerberg or Sam Altman? Kind of first meeting them.
I don't know. I would use the word impressed to describe my reaction to either of them. I mean, I think as a journalist, I'm not. I'm a little resistant to being impressed, probably. Like my goal is to not be impressed, such that I can then approach the person that I'm talking to critically. And that applies as much to a CEO as it does to anyone else, right? My goal is less to because I think everyone's human, everyone's flawed, and so I'm more interested in the flaws than I am in the gloss, so I don't know. I would say I wasn't impressed with either of them, which isn't to say that they aren't both. Like I said, they both struck me as intelligent and ambitious and interested in doing something useful in the world. I think the paths that they took to pursue their ambition are not the kind of paths that I would that I find individually particularly impressive. But again, that has to do with my own subjective assessment of what makes something impressive or not. I mean, they've built huge companies. They made a ton of money. They built products that a lot of people use. They built products that a lot of people find beneficial and that bring people, you know, joy and connection and curiosity. I mean, all those things are true, and I don't mean to discount them.
In the early part of your book, you're talking about how you're using AOL. And of course, I used AOL back in the day, so we're similar age. And then you talk about this story about how met one of your friends met up with one of the guys. And of course, the whole thing was like, it's kind of a weird situation. And I think, nowadays people probably getting catfished and things like that. But it's like, back in the early days, you had all this hope for it. And then early on, your teenage eyes are kind of like come to the reality. And now, now we're looking at Chat GPT and Facebook and all these other tools. It seems like you kind of, granted, you wrote the book, obviously, years later, so you're looking at it with hindsight eyes. But when I was reading that chapter, I was like, oh yeah, like I can relate to that. I've had I actually stopped being on AOL because I had bad experiences back in the 90s, and I do very little on social media minus this podcast, but personally I do zero online.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I found interesting when I was researching this book was that I think a lot of us have the impression that the internet back in the day was like a safer, kinder, more democratic space. In reality, what made the internet proliferate, our use of the internet proliferate in the mid 90s, was that AOL started mailing those CDs and floppy disks to all of our houses saying, hey, put this in your computer and we'll give you some free internet. And after that, you're going to have to start paying every month, right? And many of us did that. That was the beginning of the proliferation of the internet. So it was very bound up with the commercial internet, right? The first commercial website appeared in 1993, just as many of us were starting to go online. And so I think, there is this nostalgic inclination to look back and say like, oh, things used to be sweeter. I think the reality is that, again, like the potential of the internet to be a space for self-empowerment, self-expression was there at the beginning, has always been there, continues to be there. There are a lot of musicians I love who first became noticed on TikTok, right? So that continues to be the case. It also continues to be the case, just as it was in 1993, that the internet is very bound up in the desires of commercial actors.
When I talk to some of my friends, we all talk about what is like your favorite years or era to be alive. And I always find it interesting because it's like I have friends who are like, I wish I was born before the internet. And I'm like, I like the internet, but I personally preferred it more like the 90s where you had the dial up. So the internet wasn't super fast. So if you wanted to like go on and look something up, you could, but you weren't going to like sit there all day. And of course, that was way before you had it on the phone. So right. To me, I think it was like the smartphone era, really the iPhone in 2007, where all of a sudden you'd be like talking to someone at a bar and a restaurant in 2010, and they'll be like, well, that's not true. Let me bust out my phone. Or they're like taking pictures of their food and putting it on social media. Because, social media, Facebook was out before the iPhone, but it really took off once you're like, oh, look at me and my friends are at a restaurant. Look at this, linguine, whatever. Like it's super delish, whatever. Mm-hmm. I mean, what do you like? I guess, you're, like I said, we're similar age. I mean, how do you feel like the transition is do you like having that, or do you like it when it was a little bit slower, a little bit more kind of reserved, so to speak?
I mean, I love the internet. I'm on the internet a bunch. I'm less concerned, I think, with the way in which in a vacuum, if there were a technology that that inspired our curiosity and we found interesting, that we spent a lot of time with, I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with that. The problem is that, again, it's all on the terms of the big technology companies behind these products, right? So we're not just consuming Instagram in a vacuum. Meta is determining what kinds of things to prioritize and feed to us on Instagram, right? And so again, our brains and bodies are being colonized actually by the needs and desires of these big technology companies. And I think that's the thing that's problematic. I don't think I would argue there's necessarily anything problematic about, finding a delightful video on TikTok.
So do you think it'd be less invasive if there wasn't a specific algorithm programmed to people based on your data and, your search history, things like that? If you just had access to the internet without any cookies online or any history, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, it would allow for more agency on our part, right? It would make it easier for us to exercise the agency that is so important to me in this book, and which I write about at length, because these algorithms are coercive algorithms, right? Their goal, the goal of these companies is to get us to use these products for longer and longer periods because that makes them more money. It just does. And so, when we say oh, I'm addicted to my phone, I can't get off of it. There is, what I would argue is that there is an element of agency in that. We do have choice. We can put down the phone. At the same time, these companies are working really hard to try to influence us to continue to use the products, right?
Yeah, I mean, when you're trying to turn your cell phone into a slot machine and use casino techniques and whatnot, I mean, you got to have either really good willpower or I don't know, just not having an addictive personality. I'm not,
Yeah.
I'm not, everyone says that, right? But
yeah,
everyone says oh, I just don't use it. But of course, then you have to use your phone for work. You have to use your phone, or you have some classes where you have to have the iPad or whatever. So it's a lot easier said than done, I think.
it is. Yeah. And yet there is choice in it. And that's what I'm especially interested in.
Yeah, I mean, there's like I said, I don't use any of that stuff. I think there's choice, but I don't work for anyone, so it's a lot easier for me to be oh, just don't use it. Well, I don't actually have to go to work and use it, so it's easy for me to say. I mean, since we're talking, Vauhini, about your book, Searches Selfhood in the Digital Age, what would you say would be the main point that you want to get across for this podcast and your book?
Well, it has to do with that theme of agency we were talking about, right? I would love for people to read the book or listen to this podcast episode and come away understanding that when we use big technology companies' products, it's because there's something in them that we find beneficial or interesting or moving or fun, but that that suggests that we have choice in the matter. We're not being forced to use it. We're using these products because we want to on some level. And acknowledging that hopefully opens us up to think about other ways in which we could get the things that we want from technology without that being bound up in our exploitation.
And every time that new technology comes out, I mean, there's always kind of this learning curve. When the TV came out, I mean, people thought that was awful. The same thing with the radio. I mean, there's a lot of people that think that JFK wouldn't have won the presidency if it wasn't for TV. They thought Richard Nixon would have won before he won, a decade later or whatever. And so we're at, with social media. I actually had, I don't know if you know who Charles Goodhart is. He's a professor. Of course, he created Goodhart's Law. He was at the Bank of England, and I had him on the podcast, and I was talking to him about this topic, and he's almost 90 years old. And he's like, Jesse, he's like, when I used to take the tube to work in London, he's like, everyone was looking down at their newspaper. No one was talking to each other. And he's like, nowadays people are looking down at their phone. He's like, honestly, I don't know what the difference is to you. And I guess it's all kind of it's all relative, but I was like shocked that he said that.
I would argue that there is a difference though, because the companies, especially back then, behind the publications had a dual role, right? Like it was understood, especially historically at that time in the press, that the goal of a publication was in part to make money, but also to serve the public good, right? And I think that is a mission that, because of the ownership structure of these publications, especially when more of them were privately held, it was taken seriously. It was more fragmented. People were reading different publications, right? And again, like the goal in determining what went on the front page wasn't a financial goal. It wasn't about, can we get people reading, with their eyes glued to the newspaper for longer periods of time. It just wasn't. And I think there's an extent to which that's still the case, right? Like the public social good still is a priority for the traditional press. Now things are much more consolidated. It's a smaller number of platforms that have people's attention. And the public social good is just not a priority for these companies. It's not, they're publicly held. They don't have it in their charter that their goal is to inform the public, right? And so I would argue that there's a significant difference.
With the newspapers, you had, every city had their own, et cetera, et cetera. Now you have less companies, but at the same time, like if you're on YouTube, there's millions of channels. So essentially, like if a channel is a writer, you'd have more writers, but you'd have less, I guess you could say, publishers. So, I mean, I guess there's kind of like it seems to me like there's kind of a trade-off, I guess. Like you could find anything on, like if you had like the New York Times back in the day, you were going to be beholden to who they hired, versus now you can go onto YouTube, or you can go onto TikTok, or you can go onto Twitter and have access to more points of view. I would think, though.
I mean, I think that's a fair point. Yeah. And yet the algorithms are still privileging content that is going to meet financial goals rather than public service goals.
Today's guest has been Vauhini Vara, who is a journalist, prize-winning author, and today we discussed her new book, Searches, Selfhood in the Digital Age. So, Vauhini, just two final questions for you. One, just where can people find you, get a hold of your book, that sort of information? And then secondly, leave us with a final thought related to this podcast or whatever you want to have as a concluding thought.
I am primarily on Blue Sky these days with my full name, Vauhini Vara, Vauhinivara. And my book can be found wherever you get your books. It's called Searches, Selfhood in the Digital Age. And I appreciate your having me on. It's been a really interesting conversation.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.